Hello and welcome along. So to follow up on my previous video about the weapons of the Primarchs, I've decided to do, by popular demand, another video on the weapon. Now this time I'm going to focus on 4 weapons that are potentially even more powerful than the 5 weapons I listed as the Primarch's most powerful weapon. Now these 4 weapons are probably more powerful and also were not included in the previous list because they are very closely associated with the Emperor and they weren't wielded by any specific Primarch during the heresy or the pre-heresy, the Great Crusade period. And so they aren't. You can't really consider them the personal weapons of a Primarch. So the first one is almost not even a weapon, but it was used as a weapon. So this is what's known as the fulgurite. This is a kind of solidified form of the Emperor's psychic might that he, at some point, while in a battle with chaos, blasted the ground with his amazing mental powers, and it solidified as a kind of bolt of lightning in the ground. This was later found and recovered by essentially archaeologists, but the word bearers were manipulating the situation and actually wanted to recover it because they wanted to use it in ritual. It eventually found its way into the hand of John Grammaticus, who is a perpetual who was tasked by the Cabal to kill Vulcan. Now, there's quite a few things to go back over there. So, first of all, John Grammaticus is an agent of the Cabal. The Cabal are an alien organization that were operating around the time of the heresy and long before that, leading up to the heresy, who were fighting against chaos. Now, I've done a separate video on who the Cabal are, so if you want to know more about them, go and watch that video. Now, the purpose of this, finding the fulgurite and giving it to John Grammaticus to kill Vulcan, isn't really important for this video, but the point is, it was something that was expected to be able to kill a Primarch, and not just any Primarch, a Primarch who in Vulcan is a perpetual and cannot be killed, essentially. So the fulgurite would kill him, or at least the theory went, it would kill him completely. He wouldn't come back. And it was eventually used to do this after quite a long and convoluted attempt to kill Vulcan, and it did work. So it essentially stopped him regenerating, and for a long period of time he was dead, effectively. Now he did eventually come back, but that's a very long story and not for this video. But the point is, it's an exceptionally powerful tool to kill a Primarch, and therefore it was used as a weapon. It wasn't created as a weapon. But I'm going to put it on the list, and I think I'm going to put it as number 4 out of the 4 because it wasn't really a weapon as such, and so was really just a large rod of incredibly dangerous glass. Number 3 on my list is going to be the Spear of Russ. Now, this was a weapon that some people in the comments brought up in my previous video about Primarch's weapons. And now, first of all, as I said in those comments, I didn't include it because Russ never really carried it. And it existed, it was around during the Great Crusade heresy period, but he only really used it for one event, which was trying to kill Horus. Other than that, he didn't really carry it. It was available to him, but apparently he didn't like it, or didn't like the way it made him feel. He didn't want to be around it, and so he would deliberately not carry it. So he would actually lose it or pretend to lose it and leave it behind in places and things like this because he didn't want to carry it. But he also knew the Emperor wanted him to carry it, so he would occasionally carry it when the Emperor was around, so that it would to make the Emperor happy. But essentially, it wasn't his chosen sidearm. It wasn't something you would see him commonly use in battle. And that's why he kept it off the list. Now, what is it? Well, its proper name is the Dionysian Spear. Now, this was created by the Emperor himself. This was in form something like the custodian's spears that are essentially more like halberds with a bolter built into them. So they have a power blade and a bolter. That's what they use most of the time. Now, this weapon looked a lot like that, and it also had a twin, which we're going to come to in a second. It was created by the Emperor seemingly for Russ, although long before Russ existed. At least it appears that way. It seems like the Emperor created it with the expectation that Russ would need it at some point, and that's why he created it, and he gave it to Russ to carry. This is why he was quite keen on Russ always having it. We don't really know what specific thing he thought Russ would need it for, but it was said that it was prophesied or something like that. He'd foreseen that Russ would need this weapon at some point in the future. So this is a very powerful weapon. Obviously, it's created by the Emperor, who's obviously one of the most gifted weapon creators there must be. It's certainly within the Imperium, probably the most gifted. And it is created for one of the Empire's greatest heroes in Russ. So it's going to be a very effective weapon. And it is used in an attempt to kill Horus when he is empowered by Chaos, because it is considered so powerful that it might actually be able to kill him. It doesn't actually kill him because he doesn't get a clean blow with it, but it does knock the Chaos out of him. Now, this is because it has beyond its power as a weapon, its normal power as a weapon to kill things, to wound things, it has an ability to show the person that is wounded by it truths. So if anyone gets a slight cut from this thing, it will tell them some deep truth, which is an odd power to have, kind of pointless in most weapons, because you're literally going to die after you've been hit by it. So you find something out, and then as you die, basically. But in the case of Horus, it gave him the kind of the truth of who he really is, and who he is without chaos, corruption, and so on. And it kind of brought him out of that. Now, it didn't work because he then decided on his own free will to go to basically turn back to chaos. But this could be what it was actually created for, with such a weird power that this was only useful in this situation. And this may be what the Emperor had created it for in the when he originally created it, not knowing the very specific situation it was going to end up in, but he had some idea from his psychic foresight that this was a weapon with this capability to reveal the truth to the person it was hitting would be useful in a certain situation for the future of the Imperium. It's hard to say, but that would make some sense, because otherwise it's a very odd power to give to a weapon, because it just doesn't serve any real purpose. So this weapon is also really interesting because it also had a twin, and a weapon that the Emperor created at the same time that was almost identical, except it had a different power. So it had the power to tell the user, the wielder of the weapon, a truth from the person that it was hitting. And this actually was weird, that it actually worked on inanimate objects as well. So you could use it to hit an object, and that object, you could find out what the object was. This worked even to the point where Constantine Valdor, who was the person it was gifted to by the Emperor to carry, actually uses it to strike the floor of the Ventral Spirit, which is the ship of Horus, which he was on at the time, to tell him where he actually is. So you just learn the truth of, oh, your location is this. It would just know that because he's hit the floor. Now, that's a really useful power, isn't it? I mean, you can hit people and find something out that they've kept secret. You could hit a location and find out where you are. You could hit some object and find out what it is. I mean, that's a really useful power. Other than that power, it was identical to the Spear of Russ. The Spear of Russ and the Spear of... Well, actually, it's not really the Spear of Valdor. So this other spear that Valdor carried, they looked the same, but they had different names. As I said, they had different powers, and the different powers were kind of linked to the different names, and also the person they were created to wield, Russ and Valdor, were seen as aligning with those weapons. The Spear of Russ was actually called the Dionysian Spear, and the spear that Valdor carried was the Apollonian Spear. So these two names might be slightly familiar to you, and they come from Greek mythology. They're the names of two gods of the sons of Zeus, so which is kind of similar to the Emperor and his two sons, Valdor and Russ. Now, this is interesting specifically because the kind of mythology around these spears names the two people who are supposed to carry them as equal and opposite, and the weapons are equal and opposite. That means that Russ and Valdor were considered equals and opposites, which is interesting because I did a video on Valdor in which I sort of said that he's effectively the equal to a Primarch, but he's not considered a Primarch, even though he's very similar in sort of physically very similar, intellectually very similar, but he seems to be missing that warp ingredient, which is what I was kind of postulating in that video, that's what makes him not quite as good as a Primarch. But from reading up about these two spears, it's kind of implied that, well, it's not just implied, it's basically stated that he's equal to Russ. And that's quite interesting, I thought. They're also interesting that those two had a bit of a closer bond than most people had with them, because they were both kind of people that it were quite difficult to get close to. They didn't have many friends, let's put it that way. But they were quite close to each other, or at least had a higher level of respect for each other. So it's interesting. It does sort of fit with this mythology surrounding these two weapons. The idea was that the Dionysian spear represents the things that Dionysus represented, which was kind of like a chaotic spirit. So excess, savagery, drunkenness, these kind of things, which does strongly associate with Russ. And whereas the Apollonian spear represents kind of order and prudence and logic, the things that quite strongly associate with Constantine Valdor's personality. So these weapons are both incredibly powerful, created by the hand of the Emperor, specifically to aid the Imperium through two of its greatest heroes at some point in the future. So they are very high level, top tier weapons, and that's why I've given them 3 and 2. Now, I would put the Apollonian spear that Valdor had slightly above Russ's spear because I just think the power that it has to take truth from someone else is much better than giving that person a truth as they die. Or, well, they don't necessarily die because you might not kill them with the one blow, but you probably would have most people because the weapon's so powerful. You'd have to be like Primarch level to not be killed by a strike from it. So that leaves us with one weapon left. So number 1 is the Emperor's Sword. So again, this is a weapon that people brought up in the comments on the previous video. Yes, it is more powerful than the ones I listed, but it wasn't carried by a Primarch until long after the heresy. In fact, 10,000 years after the heresy, when Guilliman comes back to life. So it's not a personal weapon of the Primarchs in that sense. It's just he inherited it from the Emperor, essentially. So it is incredibly powerful. It's created by the Emperor. It embodies the Emperor's psychic might. It can cut through almost anything. It's all of those things that incredibly powerful weapons wielded by the Emperor you would imagine could do. This was a weapon that the Emperor carried personally on the battlefield when he was active, and it's the weapon he carried after he gave his spear to Constantine Valdor, which is the Apollonian spear, which apparently he carried before he gave it to Valdor. This is probably the most powerful of all weapons of the Imperium, personal weapons that is. Obviously it's not as powerful as a starship. So the weapon is essentially a massive power sword that is constantly flaming and carries the power of the Emperor's psychic ability. But it's interesting, it's not like a force sword where the user is channeling their own psychic ability through the sword. It actually has that power within it. So Guilliman obviously uses it now, and he's not a psyker. It's just the power that was put into it originally by the Emperor that is there. So which makes it a more effective weapon, really, because whoever picks it up can have that power, assuming they're able to wield it. Whereas with the force sword, you have to be a psyker to actually give that weapon power. Otherwise, it's just a lump of metal that in the shape of a sword, which is, I suppose, relatively useful, but not as useful as a power sword. So that is the 4 more weapons that are probably more powerful than the last 5 I gave you. However, you can probably see that these wouldn't have been fair to include in that list. Now, my big takeaway from this is the very interesting story of how Constantine Valdor and Russ are seen as opposites and equals, and how these 2 weapons were created for them before they existed with the foresight of the Emperor to do some important deed in the future. What that tells us, I don't know, but it's interesting. What do you think? Anyway, now I'm sure there's another 4 or 5 weapons you're all going to tell me in the comments that I've missed, but that's good, because just keep the comments coming and we can work it out in the comments, and then maybe I'll do another video on those. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share, and I will see you next time.